Right, I believe that we are live. So for anybody who's in our chat, thanks for joining us. If somebody could just comment in there that you're able to see us and hear us, that would be awesome. We've already got a couple questions in the chat. Great. Thanks everybody for joining us today in the first ever Azure Academy Q&A, and this is totally live. I have never streamed before, so please forgive me if I break any streaming etiquettes or anything like that. This is, again, the first time we're trying anything like this, and today we have with us a couple other experts around Azure, because I certainly can't know everything. And so I'll introduce first at the top here, we have Phil Gibson, and he is part of the open source upstream team today. He used to be on the fast track team with the rest of us, and Phil is an expert in a million things, but specializing around Kubernetes containers and other open source stuff. And then we have Bradley Ball. He is our data expert today, and sporting the Iron Man background. So we're going to spend some time talking about some of the cool stuff that's been out around Azure Synapse, among other data-related stuff. And then also on the stream, we have Jack Stromberg, but Jack unfortunately does not have a webcam just yet, so hopefully for the next stream we will. And Jack is an expert in pretty much everything, but I think especially around networking and storage, identity, and scuba diving, apparently, from his picture. So we've got some questions that have been asked ahead of time on social media, so we'll answer a couple of those, and then we'll get into the questions on the live chat. So let's see. First question I've got here is from Anthony29218549 on Twitter, and he asked for some best practices around Azure Files standard file shares for FSLogix profiles. So this is a Windows Virtual Desktop related question, and basically whenever you're dealing with FSLogix and user profile management, the things that you need to think about are how many users do you have, and then what is the performance requirements around those users. Do you have, let's say, 10,000 users versus 1,000 users? You're going to have very different requirements. Probably in a production environment, you want to be looking at Azure Files Premium. That'll give you guaranteed performance. And the way that that performance is set up is basically the size of the file share that you create. So 1 terabyte will give you that much performance, 10 terabytes, that much performance, etc. And then you get all of your users with their simultaneous connections connecting to that particular file share. So you might want to look at breaking them up based on host pools. You have host pools which are dedicated to your workloads. Dividing your file shares into those host pools help to spread out your I/O load. The other thing is, if you are using FSLogix and separating your Office profile and user profile, that will also help you to divide that IOPS load. Besides that, standard file permissions that's in the FSLogix documentation is a must. That way users can't write to places that they shouldn't or delete other people's data. So let's see. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Bradley for giving us a quick show of Azure Synapse, and then we'll go and answer some of the questions in the chat.
Thanks, Dean. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. It's going to take me just a second. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us a preview of Azure Synapse Workspaces. This is a new feature that went private preview. We announced it at Ignite, where we went into a private preview, and then we went into public preview just recently this past month at Build. All right, can you see my screen okay?
Yep, looks good.
Excellent. So when you get to Azure Synapse Studio, one of the things you're going to see is that we have this homepage. What this has meant is this is an experience meant to be able to greatly simplify your experience building a modern data warehouse. So there were a lot of times that we went and we met with customers and we would present a modern data warehouse topology, and then we would go, okay, here's the documentation, go build it. They said that felt a little bit like going and looking at a car at a car dealership, and then the dealership going, great, fantastic, you bought it. We're going to be shipping you the frame, the wheels, the doors, all this. Put it together yourself. And so this really, again, greatly simplifies things by bringing a lot of different aspects into one particular area. Right here in the home page, you can see we have a couple other windows. We have a data window, a develop, an orchestrate, a monitor, and a manage. You can also see right here, I can link a Power BI instance if I wanted to link a Power BI instance. So that way I can do report, development, and deployment from within this Azure Synapse Studio. So I can get our full life cycle going. And the data pane, one of the things that I can see is I can see
Uh-oh. I think we had a problem with Bradley.
Yeah, did we lose his audio?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh boy. All right. Nothing like technical difficulties. Let's see. Phil or Jack, why don't you take a look at our preset questions and go ahead and answer one of those while I look at our live chat?
Yeah, I could take one, Jack, if you want me to jump in.
Sure. Yeah. Grab the first one here, and then I'll grab the next one.
Yeah, so we got a question from, hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly. It's a Cloud Kerr, I guess. And apologies if I slaughtered that. So his question is, Docker and Kubernetes are actually changing the industry by storm, or are these buzzwords? So I looked at that and kind of chuckled. So yeah, I think the hype is real. I think if you go out to the CNCF landscape and see just how immersed the community is and the ecosystem, there's definitely a lot happening in that space. And if you're not familiar with that whole landscape, I'll drop the link into the chat here. You can go take a look at that, and you'll see just the enormous amount of projects that are just built around the Kubernetes framework. So yeah, definitely a lot of people have contributed a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in this space. So I think it's pretty legit. And to kind of just dive a little more into the question, for the Docker container framework, what it's done is it's really kind of partitioned the developer from kind of the workspace of the underpinning of the infrastructure, right? So developers, they don't necessarily have to be concerned about infrastructure patch levels, software installs, and they can just focus on their code. So by that, they are really increasing the iterations of them providing code out to their services. You then couple that with an engine like Kubernetes, container orchestration engine like Kubernetes that is providing production grade infrastructure capabilities that you just normally don't get, or you would have to really invest a lot into automations and scripting to have that. So if you think about this declarative model with, let's take deployment of pods. So I can say, hey, I want 5 of these pods running as a declarative. And, if one goes down, Kubernetes will automatically spin up another pod. So again, you just get that just out of the box where you're not spending a lot of time in development of those scenarios to keep HA available. Things like cluster autoscale, that's just kind of automatically baked into the system. So you can key on certain metrics and your cluster will just kind of autoscale on demand. And again, those are just things that your ops team just doesn't have to worry about anymore. These things just take a lot of time to coordinate between a lot of different teams, and it's really all just bundled in one config file, so to speak. So it's all definitely real.
Oh, looks like we have Bradley back.
Hey,
are you with us?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. I was tap dancing for you.
Well, you did it beautifully.
All right. Before we try to get back to your demo on Synapse, Jack, why don't you go ahead and take one of our questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sujit asked, I want to get MFA prompt or I want to prompt MFA every time an individual logs in. How do we go about this? So in regards to multi-factor authentication with Azure AD, last year at Ignite, Microsoft announced that Azure MFA, or the cloud version of MFA, is actually now going to be free for all individuals or all users that want to have an identity in Azure AD. And so the cool thing is there's two different ways to enable multi-factor authentication for your users. You can either enable them at a user level, or you can leverage something called conditional access. Now, when you enable MFA at a user level, this is the free version of MFA that they're looking at releasing. And so when I assign the user for multi-factor, when I enable them for multi-factor authentication, the default behavior is that they will be prompted for multi-factor authentication upon every login attempt. So when I try to authenticate to any of the applications, if I'm using that per user MFA, the default nature is to prompt each time. Now, conditional access, the value of that is that gives me, the administrator, the flexibility to go and pick on a per application basis of when to prompt multi-factor authentication. So, let's say that I want to prompt MFA for a third-party application I have integrated into my directory, but I don't want to prompt for the first-party integrations like SharePoint. I could use conditional access to say, hey, yep, I want to prompt this set or these sets of users for that second factor, just for that application. And maybe I want to prompt only if they're outside the organization. Conditional access is great for that scenario. Now, do note that conditional access is an Azure AD premium feature, so that is where the license now comes into play. But if you're looking for the experience where I'm going to force MFA for all my users all the time, then go ahead and check out the per user MFA enablement. If you're looking for the much more fine-grained abilities to control MFA based on a set of requirements, when and where and how, then definitely go and check out conditional access.
And Jack, looks like we have a follow-up question on that same subject at the bottom of our chat from Anmal Tandon. Can we get the option to use both security defaults along with conditional access policy?
So if I understand the question, can we do like a per user enablement, but then also have conditional access and maybe change? You definitely could enable MFA for each of the users. However, again, if you do enable conditional access for a specific application, at that time you definitely would need to look at the premium licensing. But yeah, there's nothing that's preventing you from having a subset of your users, always having that per user MFA enablement, and then having another subset of your users using conditional access. It's absolutely possible.
Cool. All right, Bradley, do you think you can give our Azure Synapse show another try here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. While you're doing that, we'll answer some questions in the live chat.
So my apologies. When I was last showing this, I think this is about the time my internet crashed, because I was discussing Workspaces and how when we came in the data window, we'd be able to see the different resources allocated to this. In here, I've got two SQL pools that I have already provisioned within this workspace. One of the important notes I would make is that the workspace acts as the logical SQL server in the front end that you will use to actually connect to these SQL pools. You can see I've also provisioned a Spark pool, which is listed here. And under my linked resources, let me refresh this. I should have my storage accounts associated with this, and any data sets that I've created, either as a part of a pipeline or to be able to be used and then pushed out to a Power BI data set. Under my development window, I've got a notebook that runs against my Spark pool process. But I can also add additional items where I could open up a SQL script, a data flow to begin working, or a Spark job definition. So if I throw open a SQL script real quick, you can see it automatically defaults to the SQL on-demand engine that I could use to be able to query against some of the underlying data files that are in my blob storage accounts. So if I come back over and I look at this, I've clicked on the data pane here. You can see this is the primary Data Lake Store 2 account that I have set up. I can actually come into this within this window, and once this comes up, I'll be able to see my directory, and I can actually begin looking at my underlying files. So I come under here, you can see that I've got a bit of a folder structure for some of my baseball data. And then under here, you can see that I can click into my events folder, and I can begin to see the data that I have right here. As a matter of fact, if I wanted to, I can open up a new bulk loading process to be able to bring some of this data directly in, where it would look at this, and then it'll actually begin to look at the schema for the underlying node. It'll pick up some issues that we may have. And then one of the things I can also do is I can define the schema to be able to define the schematized objects for these flat files that come in. I can even print that out into a script. And you'll notice that my taxi demo is still up, my script is still up, and then my ability to view my blob storage. So no matter where I go within this pane, to be able to begin working on items, it's all one user interface. And this takes you from having to flip around and go to your ADF, having to go to Data Explorer, having to go to whatever tool you're using to write your SQL scripts or your notebooks. And it gives you the capability to just flip between all of these in one interface. On top of that, I have the capability to be able to monitor my Apache jobs and also pipelines or trigger pipelines if I want to. And I can come in here and I can even manage and create SQL pools, Apache Spark pools. I could add external link services so that I can access them via pipelines. I can make my triggers. I can produce some integration runtimes if I have some on-premise sources that I need to be able to pull data in. And I can even use an access control point to come in here and manage my administration of my workspace, my Spark, or my SQL admin. And then again, this is just a brief overview of this workspace, showing you essentially how we tie all these things together just to be able to make that development for the modern data warehouse a lot easier.
Cool. And by the way, while we're going through this or any other questions, if you guys have any requests for videos on any subject, we've got folks here now who can help us out and create videos on areas that I know nothing about. So feel free to put those requests into the chat, and we'll look into making that. There was a question early on in the live chat from Robert Greenlee. Says, what is the trick to get the new Windows 10 version 2004 working with WVD? Tried to deploy my first 2 hosts yesterday, but users cannot connect to them. So, Robert, there is an issue that is happening sometimes on some of those deployments where the network side-by-side stack is not running. So you need to go to the C drive, to the deploy agents folder, and run the network side-by-side stack installation again, and then you should see that in Add and Remove Programs. You probably need to reboot the box, and then the users will be able to connect. Of course, not intended that way, so product group is looking into whatever that issue is. Jack, I think you had the next question.
Yeah, I'll grab a couple questions from the chat. So one of the first questions from Jamil. So with the Azure Migrate tool doing discovery and assessment, will that pick up or highlight any underlying issues with the existing VMs prior to migration? So the cool thing with Azure Migrate is there are 2 different pieces to that product. There's the assessment side and there's the migration side. With the assessment side during discovery, we do call out some of the underlying issues and maybe not necessarily issues, but more compatibility issues that may show up. So, if I have things like UEFI, what does that look like when I move over to Azure? The assessment will call that out. Or if I have certain disk configurations that may not be compatible just out of the box with Azure Migrate, the assessment will call that out as well. Now, things like corruption inside the operating system, it's not really intended to discover issues that are, like misconfiguration issues inside the operating system. There are two different ways to actually migrate those machines. You could do an agentless discovery and migration, or you can do an agent-based migration. If you're using the agentless discovery and migration, we're not really going to see anything inside the OS. Rather, we're going to look at it from the context of the virtual machine and the virtual hardware that's attached to it. If you're looking at an agent-based discovery, there's two different paths when we talk about agents. The first one is the dependency mapping agent, which is going to be installed inside the guest and will actually discover what dependencies that machine is talking to. So if it's connected to Active Directory, if it's making API calls to another part of your application, if it's making database calls and so forth, that would show up within the dependency mapping. The second or third scenario around agents is the actual Azure Migrate agent-based migration, and that would be an agent installed inside the guest, and that would be responsible only for enabling migration. The agent itself, again, isn't going to discover corruption or things like that. So the machine should be healthy prior to migration. Again, Azure Migrate, when it does its assessment, is going to call out configuration issues that may arise during your migration. Anything that's more machine health or corruption, I might look at using existing tools in your environment today. The other question that I also wanted to grab from the chat window was from Peter, and it said, hey, do you know if there are any plans to extend protocol support in Azure Firewall application rules to support more in HTTP, HTTPS, and SQL? I can't speak on behalf of what the product group has in mind. I'm sure down the road that extensibility, may be pushed further. The thing that I can say is when you're looking at Azure Firewall, there are two different rules, right? You have your application rules, then you have your network rules. And really the network rules are more for those non-HTTP, HTTPS type workloads. And so the network rules should satisfy that requirement today. Today it is IP based. Down the road, I'm sure that there will be additional functionality to further improve that experience. But in terms of looking at the product, I think those non-HTTPS SQL type workloads are going to be more extended into the network rules role. Cool. I'll hand it back over to you guys. Yeah.
There's another question from Jamil D that says, is WVD and VDI the same thing? And this is a kind of a tricky question. The answer is sort of, depending on what you mean. So VDI is virtual desktop infrastructure. WVD is Windows Virtual Desktop. So if you are thinking of VDI in the classic sense of server-hosted, client-based virtual machines that are intended to be either pooled or personal, yes, WVD is VDI. However, there are other things that are also being called Windows Virtual Desktop right now, which are adding some sort of confusion. There are Citrix solutions that are also being referred to as Windows Virtual Desktop because they are also VDI solutions. And while they are, in a sense, Windows Virtual Desktop, they're not the same thing as Windows Virtual Desktop natively in Azure. Citrix-based or VMware-based solutions in Azure are exactly that. They are Citrix or VMware-based managed solutions running on the Azure platform, but they are not Microsoft Windows Azure Virtual Desktop. That is a whole separate service beyond what Citrix or VMware have. There is a tie-in that you can do for licensing around the Windows 10 multi-session image when it comes to Citrix or VMware solutions in Azure, but they are not Microsoft Azure Windows Virtual Desktop running on the WVD cloud gateways and connection brokers. They use their own Citrix or VMware connection brokers for those kind of things. So they are still all VDI solutions. They are being termed as Windows Virtual Desktop solutions, but just to be clear, they're not Microsoft Azure based using the native tools in Azure. They use their own stuff. So, Phil, I think you had the next question.
Yeah, if I could get off mute here.
Yep, you're good.
All right, let me. Sure, I'm tracking this. Sorry, my screen is just flicking out here, but can't remember the name. Maybe someone here can say, but I think there was a question about entry into DevOps. Do you have to have a strong Linux background? Because I think this person came from a Windows background. So the way I would answer that is I don't think you necessarily need to have a strong Linux background. It definitely helps because a lot of the popular tools out there are kind of Linux based, but I think there's just kind of key understandings that you need to understand about DevOps, such as builds, artifacts, etc. So if you can kind of understand the full kind of process of DevOps, like how to build and ship code into an environment, and also promotion of code from different environments, from test, dev, QA, etc. Those concepts are pretty relevant across any platform. So I would say this: if you are more strong on the Windows side, definitely look at something like Azure DevOps and start working with kind of the Windows side of things, and then take those learnings, and then you can kind of branch those into things that are more kind of centric on the Linux side.
Okay. Bradley, there is one of our pre-asked questions. It's number 8 on our list about AI, ML, and IoT. I'm wondering if you can help us out with that, pre-requirements and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember this question. It was, what is the prereq really to learn AI, ML, or IoT, and are these just buzzwords? And the answer is yes, these are just buzzwords, but at the same time, there's a lot of good jobs surrounding these buzzwords and opportunities with customers and companies, and opportunities to be able to work on these. The first thing I would say is, let's break this into 2 categories, ML and IoT. For the ML, what you're talking about is machine learning, and you're talking about the field of data science. We have some great documentation from Microsoft. I'm actually going to throw in the chat after I finish answering this. And we have a short link, aka.ms/the team data science process. And we always get asked the question over and over again, Microsoft, you're a very big company. You have a lot of technological solutions and problems that you have to solve. What did you do? And this is literally our data science team put together the documentation to say this is how you would run data science and DevOps for data science within a team within your company. The key thing to remember is it is math, and you need to know math. Statistics is a very key thing for you to understand, and there's a lot of great free courses. Stanford, Harvard, MIT, they all have their courses online. Khan Academy is a fantastic resource, but you want to go and you want to make sure that you understand these concepts, and that's really going to be what allows you to be able to get in that field. Most commonly associated with that are the languages of R and Python. learn either one of them. Datacodecamp.org has fantastic tutorials to be able to take you through learning either of those. And just like many other coding languages, once you begin to get the vernacular down, you're going to understand how to be able to switch from one coding language to another, because the properties of using a data frame are very, very similar. And it's just a matter of how do I ask or answer or correlate this question in Python versus R, and how do I invoke these algorithms? And that gets me to a very important part about the math for the algorithms. When I code something in Visual Studio and it's wrong and I compile it, it throws an error at me. If I write a T-SQL statement in SSMS or Azure Data Tools and I try and run it against a source system, it throws an error at me if it's wrong. This doesn't happen in data science, because if I throw a bunch of numbers in an algorithm, it's going to go, yeah, here's the output. And so it's really important to understand that every single one of these ML models, from decision trees to linear regressions to all the different types that we have mathematical models within them that you can literally solve on paper. And what you're trying to do is take that mathematics and make a function out of it that you can call, pass data in, and get some type of actionable intelligence out. And the next thing is really understanding the vertical industry that you want to work for. When you get to a data scientist, and that's not how I would term myself, but I've talked to plenty and I understand what they do. You would actually be studying that vertical industry, reading white papers and understanding how the University of Carnegie Mellon came out with this particular white paper using this particular models for a healthcare study. And then you would take that and you would extrapolate it and you would put it against your own situational data for the company that you're working for. I consider myself more of an IT expert. I can enable a data scientist. They can tell me what they want to do, where they want their to be able to call their model that they put together within their code, or how they want to analyze it, and I can help get that done. And that really gets back into that team data science process to understand there's multiple roles that really filter this. If you understand IT and you have a master's in mathematics and you understand data science, you're a unicorn. You're worth a lot of money. Make sure you get it. But at the same time, that's a very rare skill set to find in one person. And you shouldn't expect that all of this is just going to encompass something that you should put on your shoulders and say, yeah, I can do this every single time. For IoT, Raspberry Pi. Go get a Raspberry Pi device. They've got a lot of great tutorials. Look at how you could do something as simple as gather the temperature sensor data outside of your house. And then we have plenty of Azure tutorials on taking that data and how you would stream it into Azure, store it in a repository, and maybe build a report off of it. That's a little bit easier to get to than the data science portion, because there really is a great understanding of mathematics, and it is science. So you need a good background, or at least be ready to dive in depth into that subject. But again, both of those are really architectures, and I would look at the patterns and practices of those architectures, because they will feed together. Data scientists are going to want to consume data from IoT devices. I mean, that's just a natural thing. And so when I look at those things, there's a lot of opportunity in both those fields, but prerequisite is just experience and going out and doing something. And also see if you can find a volunteer organization. I got my start in IT because I volunteered for different projects, and that made a resume that eventually got me hired somewhere doing IT work. And there's a lot of great volunteer organizations out there looking for help. So maybe also look at that as a way to contribute.
Cool. Thanks, Bradley. So let's see. David Caruso asked, what are some key things to consider in keeping costs down in implementing WVD? So I'm going to sort of answer this a little broadly. Reason why is because even though Windows Virtual Desktop sort of seems like magic, it really isn't. This is just normal, ordinary Azure virtual machines running in the cloud that we have an agent on that makes it part of the host pool. So all normal Azure cost-saving measures apply. So don't over-provision your virtual machines. Don't over-provision your storage. Right-size your workloads for whatever it is that you need. turn things off when you don't need them. That's where the scaling automation script comes in. Also, keeping an eye on things like the Azure Advisor to make sure that you're following all best practices in Azure. In your FSLogix storage, if you don't have the performance need or the number of users to be using something like NetApp files, which is an awesome solution, but on the expensive side, don't use that. Use Azure files instead. Those are ways to right-size your workloads. Some other things to look into would be things like reserved instances, where you can pre-buy the virtual machine for 1 year or 3 years and get a very reduced rate on that virtual machine. Or if your EA agreement has software assurance, you can the Azure Hybrid Use benefit, which will, that combined with reserved instances can save you basically in the neighborhood of 80+% on your VM cost. So all of those things are normal, generic Azure cost-saving measures that you can then apply to Windows Virtual Desktop, just like any other workload. And let's see, Robert had an interesting question here. And let's see, it says, I've read that you can only sysprep 8 times before it stops allowing it. I think I've probably done my Windows 10 multi-user image at least a dozen times. Is that limit gone? So that is an excellent question. I haven't sysprepped my images that many times yet to know. I haven't seen anything in the official docs saying that that limit no longer applies. The way that I've talked to people so far about it in those environments is you take an image for Windows Virtual Desktop. You should be storing that image in the shared image gallery, and then you can deploy new VMs from that, sysprep that new version of the image and save that as a new image, and then deploy that, sysprep it, and just keep going. That seems to work very well. Haven't seen anybody hitting any kind of limitations there. If the old limit of 8 times is still present, please drop it in the chat here so we can all learn, because again, we don't know everything, and there's always room to learn more stuff. Let's see. We had actually another question in the chat previously. This question looks like, and I'm probably going to brutalize this name, looks like Miss Sunny Shiny 326 asked, since Windows 10 2004 is out in Windows 10 multi-session, is there a way to upgrade from 1909 to 2004? And in the context of Windows Virtual Desktop, I'm going to propose that if you're looking at upgrading operating systems in that way, you're kind of doing it wrong. So one of the opportunities in Windows Virtual Desktop, especially with multi-session in pooled systems, is that your VM is now just something that you can throw away. Okay, the VM doesn't really matter because your applications are probably installed in your image, or you've got some tool like Configuration Manager to deploy applications on the side or after the VM is built. And when it comes to managing your existing VMs, the only time you need to really maintain them is if you're using personal VM. Now, there could be a place for that in this question, but even in personal VMs, if you are using FSLogix, then you can kind of future-proof yourself in that way. Just keep your data inside FSLogix. You can replace the underlying virtual machines with new ones, and then users are automatically upgraded to the latest version of your image or the operating system or whichever thing you're looking to upgrade in. So especially when it comes to pooled systems or remote app systems, I would look in that direction. Rip and replace kind of method, which basically looks like you want to pick your maintenance window, whatever that is, and then you say, I've got my virtual machines that are going to be ripped and replaced, let's say a quarter of your whole fleet, and then you deploy however many VMs that is, you deploy all the new ones, put the old ones into drain mode so that people get off of them. When the last user logs off, delete all of those old VMs. Okay, you'll also have to clean up the host pool and Active Directory if you're not recycling your AD computer names. And that's pretty much it. All new VMs get up and running. Next time users go to log in, they're on a new box that has a new version of the image. You can really kick this into high gear if you go back and watch my video on stateless virtual machines. And that can be used not only in WVD, but in a lot of other workloads. Sort of a containers virtual machine way of looking at your infrastructure. The VM becomes a disposable thing that you don't have to worry about and give a special name to and give it a hug. It becomes like like cattle, and we just throw it away when we don't need it anymore. All right, let's see. I haven't been watching the chat in the last couple minutes. I'll throw it out to all of you guys. Who's got the next question?
I could go. There's one.
All right.
One here. And again, this is from, I'm going to try to pronounce this right. Not sure, but again, apologies there. It's a cloud. I'm going to do Pachera. Maybe that's it. So Cloud Pachera asks, serverless computing like Azure Functions, are these for developers specifically? Because whenever I see people talk in C# or Python, in this, I guess they're saying that there's just a lot of discussion around those two languages with serverless. I'm a infrastructure side, so I guess he's on the infrastructure side. What if people also want to learn serverless? How should we approach or not approach? So this is a great question. So I would say serverless is definitely for the infrastructure folks. I think serverless is more of what I would call a event-driven model, specific if we're talking about Azure Functions. So you're waiting for a particular trigger for something to happen to respond to. But technically, you can also classify Azure Automation as a serverless platform because you're not managing the infrastructure that's actually going to be executing your scripts. So on the infrastructure side, you can totally use Azure Functions. There is PowerShell support, Node.js support, etc. So there's a lot of scripting languages that aren't compiled that you can actually use. And one way that I got started was I actually took a lot of my PowerShell scripts. So if you think about the two architectures, you got your monolith architecture where you got pretty much a PowerShell script that has like 500 plus lines in it. Versus a distributed model to where maybe now you're pulling out certain functions out of that one script, and then you're just making calls to them in an event-based way. So you can definitely take a look at all of your PowerShell scripts and say, hey, how can I kind of decouple all the functionality out of them and kind of chain them together in a series of events? And that'll actually rev you up in like a serverless event-driven model. So try that. And if you got questions, I'm sure Dean and team, we can probably come up with some new videos here on the channel.
Good to me. Let's see. Jack, there's a question Bradley just put in our chat from Wagner O, and it's on virtual network address spacing. Grab that.
Yeah, definitely. So the question is, can I change the address space on my virtual network? Yes, you can definitely change the address space. It does become a little bit tricky once you've deployed resources into your virtual network. So today you can increase the size of your address space and you can decrease the size of the address space as long as you do not have any subnets or resources deployed in that address space that would overlap with what you're shrinking it down to. There is a hidden gotcha in that if you have a design, kind of like the hub spoke architecture that's out in the Docs reference architecture center, just keep in mind that you do need to remove VNet peering prior to changing the address space size. So if you do have the hub spoke architecture deployed, you have your shared services possibly inside that hub, and then you have your spokes. I would plan that during a maintenance window disconnect the VNet peering, shrink down the address space where applicable, and then re-enable that VNet peering. That could all be done within a couple minutes, so that wouldn't be an extended maintenance window, but that would be the way to get around the VNet peering issue. I think there was also another question in there from Rajan. If you're building a production environment today, are you using the ARM model or non-ARM? So this kind of goes back to quite a few years ago. Prior to ARM or Azure Resource Manager existing, we were on what was called Service Manager. And if you open up the Azure portal today, for those that haven't seen this, you'll notice that many of your resources are labeled classic. So Service Manager as a whole for virtual machines is in the process of being sunsetted. We have different utilities that are baked into the platform to help you move or migrate your machines from the classic environment or Service Manager to Resource Manager, which is now the new way that we deploy and manage all the resources on the platform. The cool thing is when you go through Service Manager or Classic to ARM, those migrations can happen live, real time. There's no outage, there's no downtime. It is really just a translation of your old resources being built in or being presented in as the Resource Manager model. So if you do have existing virtual machines in Classic, we highly recommend that you migrate those over into the ARM model. And again, you can find that inside the Azure portal on your virtual networks or virtual machines. Now, there is another aspect to the Service Manager side, and that's around cloud services. Cloud services were part of our application development stack, which allowed you to build what we call the web and worker roles. That does not have as seamless of a migration process as just moving your virtual machines over. If you're in the cloud services model, there is quite a bit in documentation to give you some ideas on how you want to migrate those. Again, there's not a nice, easy, simple push button to migrate, but we do have some patterns that you can follow to either help port those applications over into like a VM scale set or into app services or service fabric and so forth. So cool, I'll kick that back over to you guys.
Okay. Let's see. There is a question that just came in from Niranjan. Is there a way to have customized images so that we could deploy in Azure for Red Hat or SUSE images? Our requirement is that we have file system structure that we need to follow for OS file systems. We see that none of the images available in Azure are not following our standard. Bill, I don't know if that's one that you can handle. I don't know how you are on Linux file systems.
Probably need a little more context with that. I'm reading that as they have their own custom image, and are they not able to upload that custom image to Azure? Is that how I'm reading that, or am I looking at that different? So yeah, is there a way to have custom images?
So Niranjan, if you could add a little more context
to
that
if you can,
chat, we can answer that. And I'll answer one more, and then Bradley, ask you to take another one. So there was a couple questions here about the Spring Update version of WVD scaling script and when Spring Update will be generally available. So while we cannot speak publicly about anything that is not been announced officially by the product teams, know that these things are understood to be in high demand, and we know that everyone is interested in on the features becoming generally available. Along with that, MSIX app attach is another one. So they are on the roadmap. The product group understands the urgency, and they are working to get those out general availability as fast as possible. And there was another question from Harley McPheen on how can I reduce my latency lag in my users' experience on virtual machines. We already use the Azure region. Why does Windows 10 Image not support accelerated networking? So on the accelerated networking part, I might ask Jack to help me out on this. But as far as I am aware, the first prerequisite to accelerated networking is going to be the virtual machine SKU that you are using as for your VM. So the SKU itself has to support accelerated networking. The size that I like to use a lot in my lab, which is B2MS, does not support accelerated networking, but B4S does. So just as an example. As far as latency also in the user experience, it's probably not because of not using accelerated networking. So in the user experience, first thing we want to look at is your image. What is inside your image? How many processes are running? How many threads? Also, have you looked at something like, if you're familiar with Citrix or VMware environments, they have their optimizers for VDI environments. There is one that I'm actually working on a video now from the VDI guys, which is a few Microsoft guys who are VDI experts and go back a long way in RDS. And they've put together a similar optimization script. And so I'm working with them right now to put together a video to help you to optimize WVD. And so that'll come out pretty soon. And all those kind of little things that increase the performance of your operating system as a whole. And then, of course, following normal Azure best practices for running that custom image in Azure. Make sure that all the right services are turned on or turned off would be something else I would take a look at. Jack, is there anything else on accelerated networking?
No, I think that covered it really well. The biggest thing, like Dean mentioned, is that some of the VM SKU types, they will dictate whether or not you can or cannot use accelerated networking. The other thing also to keep in mind is when you enable accelerated networking, there is a slightly different driver that's used inside the operating system. And so today, if you do go out and you look at the Microsoft docs, you will notice that, really the Windows Server Data Center, and really, I think that will also cover standard. I'll double check on the docs there, but the Windows Server SKUs are going to be supported for that accelerated networking and do have the driver support for it. That's definitely great feedback. That's something, longer term, hopefully Windows WVD does work with the networking team to bring support for that. But yep, it is a combination of both the VM SKU size and what is supported inside the operating system.
Okay, Bradley, got another question? I've got another.
I didn't see one in the chat, but I know that we've got one that was asked in the free questions.
Sure.
So there was one that came in for Jack and myself from Real Game Media, and they asked, will Front Door also work for SQL Server in both locations with geo-replicated databases with a failover group? If so, if a POP fails in the primary location, will it cause SQL Server to fail over and redirect traffic to the secondary site? So Jack and I spoke back and forth with this, and Jack agreed that the front door isn't applicable here. Typically, you're looking at front door or using Azure Traffic Manager or something like that to be able to manage the application front end. And then the application is communicating with the SQL Server on the back end. So when you're looking at the way that this architecture kind of works, that doesn't necessarily work in that way. And one of the things I would point out with geo-replication or managed instance failover groups, or if we were doing always-on availability groups in infrastructure as a service VMs where we had them for multi-region, those are not synchronous automatic failover technologies. Those are asynchronous DR technologies. And what that means is there's a dual face commit that isn't a full dual face commit. We send a transactional note to the secondary that is going to be applied to the log files, and then it goes through the redo process to data files. And once that transactional commit is sent and received, we don't wait for it to be applied. The second it is sent, we communicate back the acceptance of the receivable So there's not quite the overhead of a dual phase commit, but that's in synchronous. And that is a localized high availability technology. You would not want to do that between multiple data centers that are spread out, that are going to have a lot of latency in between them. The asynchronous copy that we do does not require the dual phase commit. It's just that we ship it, and we don't wait for the acknowledgement. We wait for the shipping before we acknowledge the commit of a transaction. You can have automatic failover for synchronous failover, and that's why that's important to understand. For asynchronous, that's considered disaster recovery. And while we might be doing everything we can to keep the other side up to date, for disaster recovery, there is the expectation, and while you could automate a process, automate checks, and automate that failover, that there will be some type of manual intervention or some type of manual check that will force that failover to happen. So I want to make sure that when we look at this, that we consider this in the right way. Again, HA locally, we can have an availability, and that's built into the nature of our PaaS applications. You don't have to worry about that for Azure SQL Database. You don't have to worry about that for managed instance. You would have to build that in on a SQL Server running on an infrastructure of a service VM, because that's just the way that works. You've got to set up all the bells and whistles on the VMs. So I hope that answered your question, but yeah, you wouldn't really use Front Door or Azure Traffic Manager to govern your failover. And if you did want to automate that, I would look at PowerShell, Azure Automation, and then you're going to want some repeating jobs that do some type of status check to be able to evaluate whether that needs to be flipped or not.
All right, we've got time for only a couple more here. Jack, I think you've got one.
Yeah, definitely working my way off mute here. So Wagner asked the question, is there a way to convert a public IP on the virtual network gateway from dynamic to static? So that's a great question. Today, when you provision the virtual network gateway, specifically, I think this is in the context of the VPN gateway, you will notice, depending on the SKU that you're using, that the public IP is dynamic. This is because of the way that the VPN gateway is deployed holistically inside the Azure ecosystem. Although it says that the IP address is dynamic, those gateways are running 24/7, 365, as long as you leave them provisioned inside of your subscription. And so while those gateways are running, the public IP address that's associated to them, although it's dynamic, will never change unless you explicitly issue like a PowerShell command to shut down or turn off those gateways. That address should persist. Now, when you look at some of the newer gateways, like the zonal VPN gateways, so the like VPN GW1.AZ, VPN Gateway 2 AZ, and so forth, you will notice that because those are zonal, the public IP address that's assigned to it is standard, and therefore those gateway SKUs will be static. So even if you want inside the Azure portal for that to change from dynamic to static, you would need to move to the zone-based gateways. But even though it does say it's dynamic, as long as you don't delete your VPN gateway, or turn it off through PowerShell, which I believe was available on the really older SKUs, that dynamic address should never change.
Okay, and Phil, do you have one more question?
We're all having problems with on the mute buttons here. Yeah, there's one question here about if I'm using an AKS cluster, how can I provide the same level of governance that I'm doing with my other resources in Azure, such as resource groups, VMs, etc. So yeah, I'd like to announce, if people aren't aware, that today in preview, we have Azure policies for AKS, and this is basically a merger of a open source project called Gatekeeper. So now you'll be able to go into your familiar Azure policy portal and start to create policies for your AKS cluster. And those things can include which repos that I want to make sure that my cluster can only pull from, what can actually run, or labels being applied to pods, etc. So very, very extensive and a good way to kind of complete your overall Azure tenant governance using the AKS service.
Awesome. Well, we are at the top of the hour, everybody, so we're going to have to cut it short there, but definitely grateful for all of the interest that everyone has showed. I think I was seeing 60 or so plus people on the chat at once here, so this is very cool. So please put in your comments in the chat if you have any other further video requests from any of us across anything in Azure. So data services, networking, storage, identity, open source, batch, clusters, AKS, virtual desktop, governance, or whatever else you could possibly think of. And we will work on creating videos and help you to keep on learning. And this has been fun. We will see you online. So y'all have a good day and stay safe out there. Thanks for joining us.
There we go.
Yep. See you, everyone. Thank you.